Number 9. Levels of a car guy. Final script. At 52, I finally bought the car I'd wanted since I was 11. A black Porsche 930 Turbo. I thought that would be the last level. It wasn't. In fact, by then I had somehow ended up back at level 1. There are 9 levels of being a car guy, and none of them are what I expected. Level 1. The Watcher. I was 11. Above my bed was a photograph of a black Porsche 930 Turbo. Not a poster, a page I had torn out of an old magazine. There was a fold through the windshield. One corner was missing, and 4 pieces of tape held it to the wall. I knew almost nothing about the car. I didn't know what turbo lag was. I didn't know what air-cooled meant. I didn't understand why the rear tires were so wide. I just knew that every time I looked at it, I wanted to understand it. So I started looking at every car, at traffic lights, in parking lots, behind garages, under covers. At school, I filled the edges of my notebooks with terrible drawings of them. The wheels were too small, the roofs were too tall, nothing looked right. But slowly, I started noticing why. On the way home, my father sometimes drove past a small repair shop. 2 lifts, cracked concrete, cars waiting outside. Every time I stared through the fence, the mechanics would listen to noises I couldn't hear, remove parts I couldn't name, and somehow make broken cars work again. That fascinated me more than the Porsche. I didn't just want cars anymore. I wanted to know what they knew. Hashtag Level 2, the owner. At 18, I bought my first car, a 1998 BMW 318i sedan, dark green, at least where the paint hadn't faded. The roof was almost gray, 1 fog light was missing, the passenger window worked occasionally, and the engine left a small oil stain almost everywhere I parked. I spent nearly everything I had on it. For the first week, I barely even drove anywhere. I just kept going outside to look at it. There is something strange about your first car. It can be objectively terrible, but the moment the key belongs to you, every problem becomes interesting. 9 days later, the front brakes started dragging. I didn't know what a brake caliper was, so I found out. Repair manual, internet forums, videos made by men who apparently considered camera focus optional. Then I bought tools, very cheap tools. The repair took almost an entire Saturday. I lost a bolt, found it, installed something backwards, removed it, installed it backwards again. Eventually, I pressed the pedal, released it, spun the wheel. It moved freely. Nothing leaked, nothing fell off, nothing exploded. I drove home with dirty hands and the windows open, not because the weather was good. The passenger window had stopped working again. I didn't care. For the first time in my life, something mechanical had been broken, and then it wasn't, because of me. That BMW wasn't my dream car. It was better. It was mine. And so were the problems. Hashtag Level 3, the mechanic. 3 years later, the clutch failed. Completely. The BMW went onto jack stands in a friend's garage, and for the first time, I had to remove something from the car that looked far too important to remove. The gearbox. By midnight, bolts covered the floor. There was grease in my hair. My friend had stopped helping, and I was lying underneath the BMW wondering whether buses were actually underrated. Eventually, the transmission came out, then the clutch, and suddenly, everything made sense. The worn friction material, the damaged pressure plate, the release bearing. For months, the car had been warning me. The pedal had changed. There had been vibration. The engagement point had moved. I had noticed all of it. I just hadn't understood what any of it meant. That's when I learned something important. Cars usually tell you what's wrong. You just have to learn their language. A vibration is information. A smell is information. A noise is information. Even the way something fails is information. The next evening, we put everything back together. I started the engine, pressed the clutch, selected first, and drove 3 meters. Then I stopped. Not because anything was wrong, because I couldn't believe it worked. After that, I started carrying tools in the trunk. Then friends started calling when their cars made noises. At first, I usually had no idea what was wrong, but now, I knew how to start finding out. Level 4, the builder. At 25, I sold the BMW. I decided I was finally ready for a serious car. So I bought a Nissan 350Z, and immediately made it worse. Coilovers, exhaust, wheels, intake, spacers, anything somebody on the internet called an upgrade, I wanted. For 6 months, the Nissan became louder, lower, harder, and somehow worse at being a car. The exhaust droned on the highway, the tires rubbed. The suspension was so stiff I could identify individual cracks in the road through my spine. It scraped on everything: speed bumps, driveways, small changes in atmospheric pressure. But parked outside a cafe, it looked fantastic. That was the problem. I had confused modification with improvement. They are not the same thing. So I started removing parts I had paid good money to install. That hurts. Proper suspension went in, correct spring rates, good tires, a sensible alignment. Parts chosen because they worked together, not because they looked good in a photograph. Slowly, the Nissan changed. It didn't become more impressive. It became better. That's when I learned that a good build isn't a list of expensive parts. It's a system. Every change affects something else: grip, comfort, noise, reliability, balance, money. Usually money. I stopped asking, what can I change, and started asking, what am I trying to make better? Level 5, the driver. At 29, I went to my first proper track day. I thought I was prepared. The Nissan had good suspension, good brakes, good tires, and more power than several cars in my group. My confidence lasted 11 minutes. Then, a standard Mazda MX-5 passed me. Not aggressively, that would have been easier. He simply appeared behind me, waited, and disappeared. Later, I found the driver in the paddock. The car was almost completely stock. I expected some explanation: professional racing experience, karting since childhood, secret suspension setup, something. He was an accountant. He had just been doing track days for 8 years. That afternoon was extremely expensive for my ego. After that, I stopped buying horsepower. I bought brake fluid, tires, fuel, and track time. I learned braking points, weight transfer, how far ahead to look, why smooth inputs feel slow from inside the car while the stopwatch says otherwise. I spun. I overheated the brakes. I destroyed tires. I made every beginner mistake. Then fewer of them. Then more complicated mistakes. The Nissan barely became faster. I did. Level 6, the professional. At 33, I rented a workshop, 2 lifts, 1 small office, and a compressor that sounded like it was trying to escape the building. I wasn't planning to start a real business. I just wanted somewhere to work. Then a friend brought his car. Then his friend brought one. Then somebody I had never met called and said, "I heard you know BMWs." A few months later, a customer brought in an E46 with a metallic knocking noise. He started the engine. I listened for 5 seconds and immediately thought, rod bearing, expensive. I almost said it. Almost. Then I looked at the customer. If this were my own car, a bad guess would cost me money. If I guessed wrong now, it would cost him money. So instead, I said, "I don't know yet." We tested the oil pressure. Fine. Checked the oil filter. Clean. Removed the belt. Started the engine again. The knock disappeared. A worn accessory pulley. Cheap, simple. not an engine. The customer never knew how close I had come to confidently telling him the wrong thing. But I did. That changed the way I worked. I started documenting everything: measurements, torque specifications, symptoms, part numbers, test results. I stopped treating experience as permission to guess. Over time, the shop got busier. I hired one mechanic, then another. People started trusting me. Not because I always knew the answer, because I had finally learned the most useful sentence a mechanic can say: I don't know yet. Level 7. The Expert. By 38, people started asking me to inspect cars before they bought them. I could walk around something for 5 minutes and notice things that would have been invisible to me 20 years earlier. Different paint texture, incorrect hardware, a panel gap slightly too large, a cold start noise lasting half a second longer than it should. Small details. But small details become patterns, and patterns become experience. I liked being good at something, maybe too much. Then one morning, a customer arrived in a 1971 Citroën SM. I opened the hood and stared. Hydraulic lines everywhere, systems I had never worked on, components arranged according to engineering logic that appeared to come from another civilization. The owner looked at me. "You've worked on one before?" Years earlier, I might have said yes, or almost. Instead, I said, "No." He looked at the engine, then back at me. "Want to learn?" The next few weeks felt strangely familiar. Manuals everywhere, diagrams on the bench, photographs before removing anything, phone calls to people who knew more than I did, questions that made me feel stupid, then less stupid, then stupid again. And I loved it. For years, I had assumed knowledge made the unknown smaller. It doesn't. Knowledge just makes you better at seeing how enormous the unknown actually is. Level 8. The Mentor. At 44, a 19-year-old drove into the workshop. 1998 BMW 318i. Dark green, faded roof. One missing fog light. I stared at it for a little too long. The kid noticed. "What?" "Nothing." He had already chosen a turbo kit. He showed it to me on his phone before I had even opened the hood. The front suspension was worn out. The rear tires were nearly bald. The brakes needed servicing. The engine leaked oil from several places. One wheel bearing had play. But he wanted boost. I told him no. He looked at me like I had personally canceled his entire future. So I handed him a flashlight. We put the BMW on the lift. I showed him the bushings, the brake hoses, the leaks, the bearing, everything he hadn't noticed because he was too busy thinking about horsepower. He couldn't afford to pay us to repair everything, so I made him an offer. Saturday mornings, empty bay. He did the work. At first, I showed him. Then I started making him find the answer in the manual. Then I stopped helping unless he could explain exactly what he didn't understand. The BMW never got the turbo. It got good brakes, fresh suspension, new tires. All the fluids changed, the leaks fixed, wheel alignment. And months later, the kid lowered it from the lift for the last time. He drove away. 20 minutes later, he came back, smiling like an idiot. I knew that smile. I had worn it myself. He wasn't happy because the BMW was fast. It wasn't. He was happy because he had made it better. Standing there, I realized something. All the things people had taught me over the years had never really belonged to me. The knowledge had just been passing through. Now, it was going somewhere else. Level 9. The car guy. I was 52 when I bought the Porsche, black, 930 turbo. The car from the picture above my bed. Not literally the same car, but close enough. When the garage door opened, for 1 second, I was 11 again. I had imagined that moment for 41 years. I expected some enormous feeling, completion, proof that everything had led somewhere. Instead, I walked around the car, checked the tires, looked underneath for leaks, opened the engine lid, and immediately wondered when the fuel lines had last been replaced. 41 years of dreaming, and apparently I had become incapable of simply looking at a car. The next morning, I took it out. No destination, just roads I knew. The steering was heavier than I expected. The pedals were slightly offset. The gearbox demanded patience. Then the turbo arrived. Not smoothly, not politely. It felt like somebody had suddenly pushed the entire car forward from behind. It was old, difficult, imperfect, and completely wonderful. Later, I stopped for fuel. When I walked back from the station, there was a kid standing near the Porsche, maybe 12. His father was waiting beside another car. The kid wasn't touching anything. He was just staring. I recognized that immediately. He pointed toward the rear. "Why is it so wide?" I started explaining, then stopped, because I remembered what being 12 felt like. I opened the passenger door. "Want to sit in it?" He looked at his father. His father nodded. The kid climbed inside carefully, hands in his lap, looking at the gauges, the steering wheel, the view through the windshield. His father took a photograph. A minute later, they left. I stood beside the Porsche and watched them drive away, and finally understood what the last level was. It wasn't buying the car from the poster. It wasn't owning a workshop. It wasn't knowing how to rebuild something, or drive quickly, or inspect a car, or have people trust your opinion. Because after 40 years around cars, there were still engines I had never opened, cars I had never driven, problems I couldn't diagnose, drivers faster than me, mechanics who could teach me things I didn't even know existed. The strange thing about getting good at something is that eventually you stop being impressed by how much you know. You become impressed by how much there still is to learn. And if you're lucky, all that knowledge takes you back to the thing you had before any of it. Curiosity. A few weeks later, somewhere across town, a 12-year-old is lying in bed. On the wall above him is a photograph his father took at a gas station. A black Porsche 930 Turbo. The photograph is slightly crooked. He doesn't know what turbo lag is. He doesn't know how an air-cooled engine works. He doesn't know how to change a clutch, set an alignment, read tire temperatures, diagnose a noise, build an engine, or any of the 1,000 other things he hasn't learned yet. Not yet. He just knows he wants to. And that's level 1.